So my name is Mavanwi Warwick and I'm EGM for Regulatory Compliance Global and Executive Sponsor for the Rule of Law initiatives at LexisNexis. Most recently, this involved being part of the Expert Reference Group for the Human Rights and Technology Project led by the Human Rights Commission. The final report was tabled in Parliament this year and contained recommendations on how to protect and promote human rights and how responsible innovation methods could be deployed to achieve positive outcomes. You can view the report at tech.humanrights.gov.au, but as a quick summary, it looks at how organisations develop and or use technologies such as AI with a particular focus on recommendations for government decision-making and accessibility. I found the project fascinating and I'm looking forward to continuing to work with people from different organisations across government, private sector, academia and civil society to come up with some practical ways the recommendations can be implemented. I'm interested in how the recommendations can apply to different role types, whether it's board members, human resources and talent acquisition specialists, product managers and procurement, just to name a few. And I'm going to attempt to tie all of these multifaceted issues back to what it means for a compliance professional, those responsible in the organisation for ensuring that regulatory and legislative frameworks are documented and actioned with the appropriate controls. For this reason, I'm going to ask each of my guests to provide some practical tips on how to make the recommendations a reality. My working theory on this is that organisations that adhere to human rights frameworks will see positive benefits across a wide range of KPIs, including employee, customer, shareholder and financial outcomes. I am honoured today to be joined by Dr Greg Adamson, who has formal qualifications in a number of disciplines and 20 years experience in the field of digital risk, providing services to companies in Australia and Europe. He is a member of AICD, a Fellow of Engineers Australia and a senior member of IEEE. He is the principal with Digital Risk Innovation Group and is on the board of the Australasian Cyber Law Institute, which has already set up a number of initiatives in response to the report. Thank you so much, Greg, for joining me today. Could we please start with a little bit about ACLI and the work that you do?
Yes, thanks, Mavanwi. It's a very interesting area, and it's an area that gets a lot of attention, but it's quite a difficult area to get your hands around, and that is the intersection of technology and regulation, technology and society. And so what ACLI has been attempting to do is bring together people with expertise in technology and also expertise in law, so individuals with expertise in both fields, in order to address the problems that can really only be addressed from the perspective of an understanding of technology combined with an understanding of regulation. And that's been, the ACLI has been working on that for the last couple of years, and is very much located within the legal profession, but also has a deep understanding and is very well connected across the technology fields. And some of the things we do, some of the things we're focused on include how to improve the quality of regulatory discussion, how to train people in this cross-disciplinary area, how to encourage early career individuals who want to develop both of these strengths to do so, and in general, how to improve the overall quality of regulation and regulatory behaviour in relation to the intersection of technology and society, especially related to the area of artificial intelligence systems.
Well, that sounds like ACLI is perfectly positioned, and so are you as their representative on the board to comment on the report and what we can do to take it forward. That nexus of law, technology and human rights is obviously something that your organisation has experience with and hopefully can help us all going forward. So the concept of explainability is mentioned numerous times in the report, including a recommendation around a centre of expertise to prioritise research on this topic. What does explainability mean in the context of AI-informed decision-making, and what do you think the particular challenges are that arise from that?
So the idea of an explanation implies a level of truth. So you don't talk about, so if I lie to you, someone wouldn't say that I'm explaining something to you, they'll say I'm lying to you.
Yeah.
And so the idea that connection between an explanation given and an explanation received and some true event or fact or issue, it connects together in quite an important way. When we talk about artificial intelligence systems, that simple connection sort of breaks down because we don't quite know how AI generally works. Now, it is definitely possible that we could understand how a very simple AI works. The AI may be designed in such a way that when one presses a button, one has a very simplistic AI machine that turns a light on. But that's a trivial example. Or to give a more common example, the idea that an AI making a decision about whether or not to grant someone a loan is simply depending on how much money they have in the bank or what their income is. These are trivial examples. These don't provide any meaning. There's no need for an AI technology to do something like that. Where AI technologies really come into their own is where there are millions of elements being considered simultaneously, and out of those millions of elements combined in some sort of way, depending on the particular AI technology, something emerges which is not, in general, is not or cannot be seen without that merging using AI. So if we consider that the challenge, what does AI do and how do we explain it, we move into a sort of interesting spot, and that is, how does AI work? Now, there's a general characteristic of technology that overall, over the past hundreds of years, we've seen this repeatedly. We build our technologies first and then we understand how they work. A device such as the steam engine. We built the steam engine in the 18th century, but we didn't understand how it worked until the laws of thermodynamics were understood in the second half of the 19th century. So for 50 or so years, we had trains driving all around Britain, in this case, without a clue how heat actually worked. We have this same situation with AI. There's no reason to think that we will understand how AI works before we start using it. And in some cases, perhaps it's simply too complex for us to understand. So this creates a dilemma. Can we use technology that we don't understand? Now, I've just given the example of the railways. Obviously, we did use the railways. The problem came about that trains would crash and we wouldn't know why. Boilers would explode and we wouldn't know why. But nevertheless, the number of people killed or maimed or whose forests were burned down by trains was small compared to the benefit that Britain considered it was receiving from the trains, and so they put up with it. In the case of AI, because of the extent and the range of applications of AI, we have a more complicated situation. And the idea that we could simply allow AI to run rampantly out of control and try to pick up the pieces afterwards is not very attractive. It's not attractive in general to people concerned about consumer rights. It's not attractive to regulators, and it's not attractive to companies producing the technology, because they feel that they want some level of certainty about that they won't be that their products won't cause some tremendous detriment, and that they'll be held accountable for that. And so the idea came along, and it was proposed by DARPA, an American government research organization, in 2016, that we should be able to explain AI, and they had this big program to explain AI. The difficulty was that many of the explanations that were produced in relation to AI weren't actually explanations. They were simply descriptions. Something like saying, well, the train came along here, a spark shot off and burnt the forest down. That's not actually an explanation of exactly what happened. It's just a description of what happened. And in the case of AI, it's even less clear because you don't see what it's doing. You just say, well, probably what happened was when we put this item into this machine, it came out with this result, and probably it did this because of X, Y, Z. But we don't actually know, as I've said, because the AI may be involving millions of variables. So that's the challenge we have. The idea this is sometimes simplified to say technologists or companies producing technology don't want to explain how their technology works because it's an intellectual property secret. But that's not what this discussion is about. This discussion is about, can we explain? Do we actually know why it happened? Can we provide an explanation that's got validity, that has some element, a sense of truth to it, not just a guess about what might have happened? That's where the question of explainability becomes very complicated. And the idea of establishing centres of expertise in this to investigate the 5 or 10 different aspects that I've just mentioned and many others beside, that it could be enormously beneficial. That's one of the working groups that ACLE has set up to assist in the delivery of the report.
So I think you've really articulated very clearly what the problem is, and it sounds like the report, in identifying that, also is an issue that we should address as a group. And possibly there are also two different kinds of explainability. There'll be an explainability to people with technical expertise, but also an explainability to the ordinary person, if I can use that phrase, who may be affected, especially by government decisions, in understanding what that means, and then use possibly existing avenues of natural justice or administrative law to address the decision if they see a problem with that. So in terms of, though, what we can do now, I think human rights impact assessments was one of the recommendations for both government and the private sector. Certainly they exist, but are there other tools already in use that could provide a template that organisations might pick up if they were interested in avoiding the many different kinds of problems that you've already highlighted, in terms of either having to retrofit a product, reputational damage, court fines, or just, not meeting societal expectations, which can also have flow-on effect to investment? But how would you recommend organisations go about trying to understand what it means and how to really future-proof it for society and for the organisation in general?
So this is a difficult area, and it's not difficult just because the problem is difficult. It's difficult because within the context of technology, technologists are not used to thinking about their ethical responsibilities as such. So technologists are used to for example, their safety responsibilities, which one could say is an ethical responsibility. Technology, the IEEE, which is the organisation that I volunteer in, adopted its Code of Ethics in 1912. So it's been thinking about those ethical issues for more than 100 years. But there are limits to the way we've thought about that in the past. We haven't sort of come to each time we work on a technology, we haven't come to that technology and thought, is this technology going to exercise bias? Is it going to ignore people with disabilities? Is it going to, and so forth? We just haven't thought about that because technologies before artificial intelligence systems were so different. They were far more predictable, not completely predictable, but far more predictable. So that encouraged the first round of responses to that, and IEEE was one of the first of these in 2016, was to look at sets of principles or ethical codes or statements of requirement that would say, for example, no bias, has to be transparent, has to function the way it's supposed to function, and so forth. And hundreds of these over the subsequent 5 years, up to now, hundreds of these have been developed, perhaps thousands of these. So each state government has organised a workshop where people come together and identify the 6 or 8 or 12 principles that they want to be guided by in their AI work. Federally, we did that at a state level. We did that federally, internationally, right across the world. It's being done. However, after a couple of years, people started to say, well, it's all very nice having a set of principles, but how do we actually turn that into practice? How do we actually guide practice in our creation and adoption of technology?
Right.
And at that point, a lot of these initiatives floundered. And it's not that they failed, it's just that they didn't actually have a next step. The approach that IEEE took was that, and this is not the only approach one could take, but I would argue that it's a valuable approach. IEEE, which had done its ethical discussions around around responsibility and AI and ethics within the context of its standards organization, decided to put forward a proposal for a series of standards that could provide guidance. IEEE is very famous for standards such as Wi-Fi and local area network. So IEEE standards influence more than half the world's population every day. So IEEE is very good at putting together platforms that standards can be built on. And then the next part of that is, if you're going to have standards, then you need a mechanism to accredit those standards and determine whether organizations which adopt the standards are applying the standards. And so standards and accreditation bodies sort of sit hand in hand. And to have an accrediting body, you need an accrediting framework that says this is the way you would test this standard and determine if it's being applied. So IEEE established a series of standards, initially the set of standards called P7000. And there are around 15 or so of these standards so far. And they look at the handling in relation to the ethical application of the development of AI technologies. And they look at questions such as bias, questions such as trustworthiness of information sources, the terms and conditions sitting within technology products, and a whole bunch of different standards like that, frameworks for consideration in the adoption of AI technologies. And some of the world's largest technology organizations have been involved in the development of those standards, because it wouldn't be any exaggeration to say every single significant technology organization in the world would include IEEE members. So that's a focus that we have, and it's a focus that's, I think, providing a material way that people can engage with lofty ideas which can just remain as lofty ideas. We bring those down. We make those material. And just to place this in context, IEEE is very heavily involved in the standards by which the most basic parts of machines work, such as the design of integrated circuits and the design of communications equipment and so forth. So we can look at those standards right from the bottom up and ensure that, for example, an IoT device doesn't accidentally facilitate domestic violence, which was a problem that we found 2 or 3 years ago.
Well, I think that, that's obviously the right approach to take, because this isn't something where we can just have lofty ideals. We do need to understand this from the ground up, as you say. But interesting point, I think, on how lofty ideals do translate in reality. And, even words like ethics are not as well defined, for example, as human rights protocols that governments certainly have signed up to and are therefore no longer voluntary. But what do you think about the development and use of voluntary standards and certification schemes as opposed to the mandated standards? Are there existing global standards Australia can and or should look to?
So the relationship, I think it's most useful to consider the relationship between voluntary standards and regulatory compulsion as a continuum. For example, a bank may sign up to a voluntary code of conduct, but if it puts a mention of that code of conduct into the contract that it has with its customers, it's then contractually bound to that voluntary code because it's part of a contract. So this can be, one of the key things in considering this is that the bright lines don't necessarily exist between a voluntary and a non-voluntary approach. And quite often a government will start off with a voluntary approach with a sort of not very well concealed stick saying, this is the voluntary approach we want you to take. If you don't take it, we're going to put it into law. I think When we look at this, I think it's probably best to come at it from an understanding of how we protect people's human rights. And if we make the protection, if we said to slaveholders in the 18th century, you may or may not want to release your slaves, but if you're a moral person, you will release your slaves. That would not have had any meaning to people in the slave industry. So individuals may have decided that they didn't want to be in the slave industry anymore, but for people in the slave industry, that was their job. And it was only when the government said slavery is illegal and sent out large warships to enforce that slavery was ended as in its traditional sense, although obviously it continues today in various other ways and that has to be combated. We also get into a difficult place where people deliberately refuse to follow a guideline and use ethics as their cover by which they refuse to follow a guideline. And that can be one point that a leading authority in the field made to me a few years ago was that the ethics discussion was in some ways toxic because it wasn't a serious discussion about ethics. It wasn't discussing whether or not Kant or Aristotle were right in their ethical assertions. It was figuring out how a company could minimize its costs by saying that instead of something being an obligation anymore, it was a voluntary choice, and therefore they didn't have to worry about it. That did become toxic for a period. I think there's no way around enforcement of human rights. There's simply no way around it. If human rights aren't obligatory, then people who don't want to respect them won't respect them, and humans will suffer. If we want to prevent that happening, we need to enforce, just as we'd enforce a law against killing, we should enforce a law against discrimination based on the sort of things that discrimination is commonly based on. And when it comes to AI systems and designing AI systems, if we simply say, let the technology function as it will, but please think about your ethical obligations when you're in this industry, that doesn't actually provide a very useful guide at all, and it certainly doesn't assist those people who want to be ethical, because they'll be competing with people who don't want to be ethical and who refuse to undertake the effort and cost of doing things in an ethical way.
Yeah, and do you think, though, there is a place for, I guess, the carrot as well as the stick? The report does comment on, tax incentives or other ways to encourage organisations to align with the other recommendations in the report.
So, as I said, this is a continuum, and you're dealing with human behaviour, and human behaviour responds differently to different humans respond differently to different motives. I would suggest that at the end of the day, there has to be a stopping point. There has to be a line that says, beyond here, you're breaking the law. However, there are many, many ways that companies can do better things than simply not breaking the law. And motivations, whether they're tax incentives or additional flexibility given to companies that take positive action in the amount of time they're regulated, that sort of risk-based approach to regulation of organizations, so they can reduce their red tape burden by doing the right thing. Those will certainly help to facilitate a discussion within a company deciding perhaps a hard-nosed discussion about whether to do X or Y, and some sort of the carrot can help to encourage them to do the right thing in that case.
Yeah, I think you're right. This is a continuum, and because the technology is evolving and will continue to evolve much faster than the regulatory landscape, having these kinds of recommendations, but also constant review, which is not only part of a human rights impact assessment, but also a compliance risk management tool as well. So before we go off into those lofty elements of what may come in the future, are there any practical ways you would suggest that organisations can look to implement the recommendations now?
So the recommendations are extremely good. The recommendations break new ground. However, the type of things that the recommendations suggest are consistent with the sort of challenges that organisations have had in the past. Just to give you an example, when a company is deciding whether or not to offshore particular roles within the company, it would do a risk assessment to understand whether direct and indirect consequences of that offshoring are going to impact the company in an unexpected way. However, I'm not aware from those organizations that I've worked with, I'm not aware that there's any sort of common understanding that we should do a similar assessment when we onboard AI technologies within our organization. And yet the sort of problems that automating systems currently done by human staff can bring are very, very similar to the sort of problems that can occur when you take half your manufacturing and move it to the other side of the world and lose that direct control and potentially face some domestic concerns. So taking those risk-based approaches and applying those to the things that to the proposals that the report is making, I think is very beneficial, because suddenly you're placing yourself in a framework that you're used to, that is managing risk. You're applying it to a new risk. Well, new risks always come along. You're doing it in a structured way, so it's not sitting around and having an emotive screaming match. It's actually sitting around and having a productive discussion about the best way to achieve something. And that can be very I think that can be very productive. Just one final point I'd like to say is that, and this goes back to Immanuel Kant and his approach to ethics. In what we do, we should imagine what we do is what everybody in the world does. If what we do is what everybody in the world does, is that going to create the world that we want to live in? And if the answer is no, then that's a warning. And a company can think about that just as much as an individual. And the proposals that come up in the report, which both the principles-based ones and the very specific suggestions, they're the sort of things that can provide a terrific basis for a discussion about that. What sort of world are we as individuals and our company building? And is that where we want to go? Is that avoiding the things we want to avoid? Is that going to give us a sense of that we've met some sort of social purpose? Once again, I've ended up with a very fluffy high principle, but I think I like to think of the practical and the principles at the same time. I don't think they should be separated.
Yeah, and I don't think it's particularly fluffy when you think of the rise of social activism, the awareness of consumers, employees, investors in understanding where a company is. And I've certainly heard that although the not-for-profit sector likes to now call themselves the for-purpose sector, there's certainly also a lot of commercial and government organisations who also look to find that purpose in what they're doing. So I think that's a lovely way to end our discussion today. Thank you so much, Greg, for taking the time and sharing some of your expertise.
Thanks very much, Vanwi. Great to talk.